We'll keep you updated on the latest details as they emerge. Joining us in studio is Daniel Shek, former Israeli ambassador to France. Thank you for being with us. And David Harel, CEO of ASERO Security Consulting, also a former retired member of the Israeli Security Agency. Appreciate you both being with us here. First, Ambassador Shek, with the latest now, we're talking about security in Europe. Are you impressed? Are you not impressed? Obviously, today is not a good showing for the security forces across Europe, but what do you see in terms of the effort being put in?
Well, I think there are several things to be said. First of all, this is the new pattern for making a real strong statement, and that is to have multiple attacks on the same day, the same place, attacks, to show that this is a well-organized group and not just some random moment of anger. The second point is, and I've said this many times, including in this studio, when the recurring attacks in France occurred, there was a lot of empathy around Europe and around the world for the French. And I kept saying, empathy is fine, but you got to get prepared because it's going to happen in your capitals too. There's no reason why it should be confined to France. And Belgium is, sadly, I must say, an obvious venue for such attacks, since we know that even some of the Paris attacks were prepared and organized and masterminded in Brussels. So, you know, there's a learning curve. It's a very sad thing. It's like children who need to get burnt before they understand that something is hot. And in theory, it's difficult to prepare. Once things happen, you escalate your ability to fight it. It happened
like
in France.
In France, exactly.
There was a wave after wave of terror attacks, and in response, wave after wave of legislation, of tighter security, of state of emergency, all sorts of things that gave the security services tools that might have been unthinkable 10 or 20 years ago.
Do you believe France is heading in the right direction in terms of their broad, sweeping legislation now that they've enacted?
It probably is in the right direction, but who can tell if it's on target, and what is the target? I mean, we're sitting in a studio in a country that's been battling terrorism for decades, and we can't say that we found the trick to completely protect ourselves from terror attacks. We have to understand, terror is part of life in the 21st century, and there's no point in all this populist talk that I've heard even now, cleaning up Molenbeek, eradicating terrorism. You don't eradicate terrorism. That's just nonsense. You fight terrorism like you fight, for example, organized crime. You hope to make life very difficult for the organized criminals, but you don't set a target in saying there will be no crime anymore.
David Harel, we're obviously moved away from some of the lone wolf attacks that we've seen, is primarily specifically characterized in Israel, where we've seen all these lone wolf style attacks. What's taking place today in Brussels, obviously not that. This is organized, this is coordinated. What are the implications of that?
First of all, I'd like to say I agree with every word that Daniel said, and even our ambassadors are security experts. But
yes.
No, this is
life
not
in the 21st century.
That's right, indeed. This certainly isn't a lone wolf attack. We're seeing a coordinated attack, and they're talking already. There's been official reports that we're talking about suicide bombings. So we're talking about multiple suicide bombings coordinated at the same time at rush hour. And the fact it hit the airport, that is so symbolic. You know, airports are symbols of a country's, I don't know, integrity, everything. That's very strong symbols.
And very disruptive when they're hit. Obviously, transportation shuts down, commerce. This
the
is a
link
real
to the
shutdown
outside. I mean, look what they've done. It's
right.
like a multiple attack on infrastructures. They've closed down the metro, and they've closed down the airport and the aviation to and fro from Belgium as a consequence. And we don't know what else. The day is still young, and we don't know if anything else is planned, of course. So yes, it's a very significant attack. The impact very significant. And we'll have to see how this is going to play out. I don't think it's going to be a one-off thing.
Well, some would say that the airport security in Brussels, or perhaps it's obvious today that the airport security was not up to standard at the Brussels airport, but seemingly this would be not a soft target, an airport, with the amount of security that usually goes into these types of facilities.
I agree with you. I know for a fact, where we do a lot of assessments at airports all around the world, you go to London Heathrow, you see it's well protected, you see armed police. Now you go to Paris, since what happened in last November, and go a year before that, Charlie Hebdo's, there we see the right presence. But most airports today, they focus on security begins at the checkpoint, and they only thinking about bombs getting on planes, and they forget about the past, that just as disruptive can be bombs blowing up inside the terminal, and they forget the attack, I believe it was 2008, I believe, a attempted double suicide bombing against the Glasgow airport. So airports and aviation have been attacked, and we have to note that ISIS seems to now have begun targeting aviation. We have to remember the attack against the Metrojet plane. I think that was December of last year, November or December of last year. Was ISIS took responsibility, even showed the bomb they used to bring down the plane. And then we had the event in Somalia, where we have an attempt to bring down the plane, and that is also an ISIS-linked group. So we see ISIS now beginning to move towards aviation, which is a worrying phenomenon.
Ambassador Shek, you mentioned Israel being used to these waves of terror, obviously has never known a year without terror. Europe is quite the opposite, and perhaps up until recent history now, the example of a quiet place where no conflict was known. You know Europeans. How do you think the Europeans will deal with this new reality that they're facing?
Well, I think it's one more layer in a trend of a defensive attitude. You know, after decades of openness, liberalism, cooperation under the roof of the European Union, there has been anyway already a retraction of some of these trends because of the economic crisis, because of all sorts of nationalistic movements within the individual states, the immigration question. All these have reawakened a more defensive, possibly nationalistic character within individual European countries. And it's a big question how this is going to play out. Certainly, these kinds of attacks, which create frustration, which create anger, which create, to a certain degree, bigotry, because you tend to generalize the problem. I was asked earlier how this is going to play out in the context of relations between religious groups within European populations. If you look at a country like Belgium, where there's a huge proportion, a huge percentage of Muslim population, this will do no good to the image of these populations all across Europe, and very unjustly so, because it is true that the overwhelming majority of terror attacks come from Muslims, but it is not true that the overwhelming majority of Muslims are terrorists. So, but these things tend to blur in moments of anger, and it's a big question. I don't know.
Speaking of the profiling of people now, which is obviously an important part of the anti-terror campaign, something that Israel has been doing for years, something that's a touchy subject in Western countries.
Very touchy, but
profile those people at security checks, for example, at the airport. Do you think that racial profiling is simply an inevitable step?
That's the wrong word. We're not talking about racial profiling. That racial profiling is a bad thing anywhere. It's bad in Israel. It's bad in Europe. It's bad in the States.
Even in terms of security, where we know that certain population groups
what you're saying, to racially
attacks.
profile is to take how many? We have over 1.5 million Arab citizens in Israel. Are we going to say these 1.5 million are all a threat and we have to address them as suspects? That's ridiculous.
Well, many of them feel that way.
Certainly.
But let me just correct and say, but when we talk about profiling, we're talking about behavioral profiling, and this is something that's going to have to be done now. I mean, people understand these two suicide bombers. They came from the outside. They arrived at the airport. We don't know if they came by car, by bus, by train. They walked in through doors. I would assume that they had certain behaviors that could have been detected. They would have been wearing vests. If you saw the suicide bomber in Turkey the other day, where he walked with his arms crossed, walking in a very unusual way, you can't detect these everywhere. But a place like an airport, where you can put access control measures in place, you would expect that an airport should be able to deal with things like this. And we will definitely see more behavioral detection programs being implemented, as they are already in Israel, in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and they've been piloted in Canada, for example. So yes, I think we're going down that road, but not racial profiling.
Back in the studio with our guests, you hear the situation on the streets of Brussels now. It sounds like almost complete lockdown again. Military patrols have returned to the streets. Is this just the new reality? Do you agree with Ambassador Shek that this is it? This is the new reality for Europe, and in particular today, Belgium and Brussels?
Well, it's certainly going to be for the next few days, weeks, and possibly months until they make an evaluation, a different evaluation. We remember what happened in London with the 7th of July attacks when London was locked down. We remember 9/11 when Manhattan and well, basically the whole of New York, of the USA almost came to a standstill. People were locked and watching the screens and as Daniel said, it's all about terrorizing, and you terrorize people in such a way that they are unable to go about their everyday life. And this is what's happening at the moment, and it's now up to the police and security forces to try and show calm and order and restore faith in security and get some positive messages that we're able to get control of this. Otherwise, you know, the morale of the public goes down, and this is what the terrorists see.
Well, speaking of messaging here and the terror that comes with this type of attack, again, the state prosecutor in Belgium confirmed this is a terror attack today.
A suicide bombing.
We know that. The suicide bombing, and they've confirmed again, right, this is terror, in case anyone still is in denial about that fact. How the terror is likely to affect people specifically from the top down. Are we likely to see acts of fear forcing more soldiers into the streets here now? Is that inevitable as well, to see increased security, military control, martial law essentially being in effect? And again, this is all happening in Brussels. This is the seat of the European Union.
Martial law is a strong word.
Perhaps.
Martial law includes also taking over government, etc., which I don't think is the case. But I do think that people in such situations want to feel reassured. And one of the ways for a government to reassure people is by a stronger presence of security and of police on the streets. They just want to see the uniforms. There's a lot of psychology here going on. And the truth is that the solidity of a society in these cases is measured by two things, and you grow accustomed to them. It takes time. The first is for the population to be part of the effort against terrorists, to open their eyes, to look around, to be alert about things. Is one of the things that is very characteristic in Israel. And the second, which is also a great strength in Israel, is the power of recuperation. How fast do you go back to normal after such an attack? Which is remarkable here, and which is why, in a certain sense, you may say that despite decades and decades of terror, terrorists have failed because they can't shut down life in Tel Aviv or in Jerusalem or anywhere in Israel. And that is, I think, the big challenge for European cities now, to show this a level of resilience. But they can
Could I just add to that and say, for an example, in suicide bombings on buses in the center of Jerusalem, in Tel Aviv, within the attack has taken place at 9 o'clock in the morning, and by 12 o'clock, everything has been back to normal.